I still remember the exact moment the silverware stopped clinking. My fiancé's father, Dr. Gerald Webb, a retired orthopedic surgeon with 40 years of practice and the particular confidence that comes from never being wrong in a room, had both elbows resting on the edge of the dining table. He was leaning slightly forward, the way a professor leans toward a student who clearly hasn't done the reading. His voice had that measured, patient quality, not slow enough to be condescending, but just slow enough to let you know he thought he needed to slow down. "The problem with emergency medicine today," he said, cutting a clean line through his turkey, "is that the young physicians coming up now have never had to earn it the hard way. They have protocols for everything, algorithms, decision trees. They follow a flowchart and call it clinical judgment." He set his fork down for a moment and looked at me directly across the table. "No offense to anyone in the room," he said. "I'm sure the people you work with are very competent." Marcus shifted in his seat beside me. His mother Sandra kept her eyes on her plate, moving a spoonful of cranberry sauce from one side to the other. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap, met Gerald's eyes across the candlelight, and said, very quietly, "None taken." He nodded, satisfied, and picked his fork back up. That was the moment I realized the evening still had a long way to go. To understand how we ended up at that table, how a Christmas Eve dinner in a Nashville suburb became the most clarifying 4 hours of my relationship with Marcus, you have to go back about 3 weeks. To a Tuesday night in my apartment when Marcus came over carrying takeout and a slightly apologetic expression that I had learned to recognize. I had been on shift for 14 hours. I was still in the clothes I'd worn to the hospital, sitting on the couch with my feet tucked under me, barely awake. Marcus let himself in with his key, set the food on the counter, and then stood there for a moment before sitting down across from me. "My parents want us to come for Christmas Eve," he said. I smiled. "That sounds nice." He looked at the coffee table. "There's one thing. In my experience, there's one thing is almost never one thing." Marcus is a pharmaceutical research scientist. He thinks in careful, precise language. When he hesitates before a sentence, it usually means he has thought about it more than he wants to let on. I waited. "My dad," he started. Then he stopped. Then he started again. "My dad is Gerald Webb." I knew that already. I also knew Gerald Webb had practiced orthopedics for 4 decades, that he had opinions about modern medicine the way some people have opinions about politics, loudly, frequently, and with very little invitation. Marcus had mentioned him in passing over the 1.5 years we had been together. Never unkindly, but always with that particular careful tone people use when they love someone who is difficult. "He doesn't know you're a trauma attending," Marcus said. I looked at him. "What does he think I do?" Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "I told him you work at the hospital. In the ER. Marcus, that's technically true. I might have let him assume you were a nurse." There was a long pause. "You let your father think I'm a nurse." He winced. I didn't correct him when he assumed. I was quiet for a moment. Not angry, exactly. More curious. How long has he thought that? "About 8 months. You've been letting him think that for 8 months. I kept meaning to say something. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. But every time I got close to bringing it up, I thought about how the conversation would go, and then I found a reason to bring it up later. "What did you think would happen?" Marcus looked at me carefully. "He would stop thinking about you as a person and start thinking about your resume. And I wanted him to meet you first." He paused. He has very specific ideas about medicine, about who belongs at the top of a department and how they should have gotten there. I understood what he was saying without him having to finish it. After 31 years of being female in a field that spent decades making that difficult, I recognized the shape of that sentence before it was complete. I sat with it for a moment. Honestly, the idea of walking into Gerald Webb's house as simply Marcus's fiancé, not Dr. Holt, not the trauma attending, not the youngest person to hold that position at St. Catherine's Medical Center sounded almost like a relief. My whole life, introductions had come loaded with credentials. Sometimes that was useful. Sometimes it just meant the first 20 minutes of any conversation were spent convincing someone that the credentials were real. "All right," I said finally. Marcus blinked. "All right? I'll come to dinner. I'll let him get to know me first." I looked at him. "But Marcus, if he asks me directly, I'm not going to lie." He nodded quickly. "Of course. Absolutely." I picked up my chopsticks. "And you owe me." He smiled, relieved, and that was the end of it. Or so I thought. What I hadn't fully accounted for was Gerald Webb in person. We drove to his parents' house on Christmas Eve. Marcus's family lived in a quiet neighborhood in Brentwood, the kind of street where every house had a wreath on the door and the lights were tasteful and white. Gerald's house was a large colonial with a flag out front and a navy blue Volvo in the driveway that had a faded Vanderbilt Medicine parking sticker on the bumper. Old habits. Marcus parked but didn't get out immediately. He turned off the engine and sat there for a second. "He's going to ask about your work," he said. I assumed. Just he might push on things. Marcus chose his words carefully. "He retired 2 years ago, and I think he misses having people to instruct. I'll manage. I know you will. I just want you to know going in." I touched his arm. "Marcus. I spent 3 years as the only female resident in a trauma surgery program where the attending who supervised me genuinely believed women didn't have the temperament for emergency medicine." I looked at him. "Your father and I will be fine." He laughed softly, and we got out of the car. Gerald opened the front door before we reached the porch. He was a tall man, still straight-backed at 72, with silver hair and the kind of handshake that communicates a whole history in 3 seconds. He gripped Marcus's hand firmly, smiled, then turned to me. His eyes did what certain doctors' eyes always do, a quick, involuntary assessment, checking for something he couldn't name. "You must be Claire." "That's right. It's so nice to finally meet you." His handshake was measured. Not unfriendly, but not warm either. "Gerald Webb, come in." Behind him, Sandra appeared in the hallway. She was small and soft-spoken, with the particular warmth of someone who has spent decades making other people feel welcome in a house that sometimes needed it. She hugged Marcus, then turned to me with genuine brightness. "We are so glad you're here." She took my coat. "Marcus talks about you constantly. Only good things, I hope." "Mostly good things," Marcus said, and Sandra laughed. The house smelled like pine branches and something roasting in the oven. Gerald led us through to the living room, where a fire was going and a Christmas tree stood in the corner, hung with ornaments that clearly spanned several decades. The kind of tree where you can see a whole family's history if you look closely. I noticed a small ceramic stethoscope ornament near the top. We settled into the living room. Marcus sat beside me on the sofa. Gerald took the armchair across from us and crossed one leg over the other in the way people do when they're comfortable and know it. The first 20 minutes were easy. Sandra brought out eggnog. Gerald asked about the drive down, mentioned traffic on I-65. Marcus talked about a project he was finishing at the lab. I asked about their other son's children, who were spending Christmas in Florida, and Sandra lit up talking about her grandchildren. Gerald answered a few questions about retirement, fishing, woodworking, a trip to Portugal they'd taken in September. Then Sandra excused herself to check on dinner, and the conversation shifted in the way conversations tend to shift when the most diplomatic person in the room leaves it. Gerald looked at me with the polite curiosity of a man who has been waiting to ask something. "Marcus tells me you work at St. Catherine's." "That's right. Good hospital." "I referred patients there occasionally over the years." He nodded approvingly. "The ER team there is solid." "They are." He smiled a little. "Long hours in emergency medicine." "You must be used to that by now." "You get used to a lot of things." He seemed to appreciate that answer. It confirmed something he already believed. That's the job. That's always been the job. He settled back slightly. "I was in the OR at 5 in the morning more times than I can count. You don't last 40 years in surgery without learning to run on very little sleep and a great deal of stubbornness." Marcus smiled carefully. I kept my expression open and interested. "Orthopedics?" I asked. Gerald's posture lifted slightly. 41 years. Hip and knee reconstruction primarily, some complex spine work in my earlier years. He tapped his knee once. "I've replaced more of those than I can count." "That's a long time to be in the OR." "It is." He looked at me. "Do you enjoy the ER?" The question was asked with the particular tone of someone who has already decided the answer is yes, and is also mildly surprised that anyone with real ambition would settle there. "Very much," I said. He nodded once. "It's important work. The front lines." There was the faintest pause. "Demanding in a different way than the surgical specialties. Of course. More reactive than planned. But the nurses and techs who make that department run essential. Absolutely essential." Marcus looked at the fireplace. I said, "It takes a strong team." "Exactly right." Gerald was warming to the subject now. That's something the younger generation sometimes misses, actually. The value of experience at every level. Not just the physicians calling the shots, but everyone around them. He looked at me with something that was almost kindness. I always believed in that. The best residents I supervised understood it, too. Sandra called from the kitchen that dinner was ready in 10 minutes. Gerald stood, and as he did, he said not cruelly, just conversationally, "You enjoy working with the doctors there? The attendings?" Something in Marcus's expression went very still. I said, "Every day." Gerald smiled and walked toward the dining room. Dinner was beautiful. Sandra had roasted a turkey with herbs from her garden, and there were mashed potatoes and green beans and 2 kinds of pie cooling on the counter. The table was set with the good china, the kind that comes out twice a year and carries the weight of everyone who has ever eaten off it. We sat, Gerald at the head, Sandra to his left, Marcus beside me. For a while, it was genuinely lovely. Sandra told a story about a Christmas 20 years ago when Gerald had gotten completely lost trying to assemble a bicycle at 2 in the morning. Gerald laughed at himself, telling the part where he'd had to call his neighbor for help. Marcus relaxed beside me. I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the whole evening. Then Gerald refilled his wine glass and said, "You know what I miss most about practicing?" Marcus said, "The ore? The mentorship." Gerald cut into his turkey with the clean efficiency of someone who has made incisions for 4 decades. There's something irreplaceable about watching someone develop clinical judgment in real time. You can't teach it from a textbook. You can't simulate it. He looked at Marcus. That's the thing your generation doesn't fully appreciate. The way knowledge used to pass down directly. Hand to hand. Oar to oar. Things do change, Marcus said carefully. They change, Gerald agreed. Not always for the better. He glanced at me. No offense to anyone working in the system now. I'm sure the protocols are very sophisticated. They're useful, I said. Gerald tilted his head. Useful, yes. But there's a difference between following a protocol and actually understanding why, between knowing the algorithm and knowing the patient. He set his knife down. The best physicians I ever trained, the ones who became truly excellent, they didn't rely on checklists. They relied on instinct. And instinct is earned. It takes years. He looked directly at me. It takes a particular kind of pressure that I'm not sure the current training structure creates. Marcus cleared his throat. Dad, I'm just making conversation. Gerald smiled pleasantly and picked up his fork. I'm not criticizing anyone. I'm talking about the nature of clinical experience. Sandra said, Gerald, perhaps we could talk about Portugal. We talked about Portugal. We could talk about it more. Gerald chuckled. I'm simply saying that medicine is one of those fields where wisdom cannot be rushed. You earn it in the trenches. In the difficult cases. In the moments where the textbook doesn't give you the answer and you have to reach for something deeper. He looked at me again. I imagine even in the ER you've seen that. The experienced attendings who just know. Who walk into a room and see something everyone else missed. Yes, I said. I've seen that. He nodded, satisfied. That's what I mean. That comes from decades of showing up. He gestured slightly with his fork. It's not something a young person can have, no matter how good their board scores are. Some things cannot be taught. They can only be lived. The room was a little quieter after that. Marcus put down his glass of water. He looked at his father for a moment, and then he said, Dad, Claire understands medicine better than you might think. Gerald raised an eyebrow. I'm sure she does. I'm speaking generally. I know, but I want you to understand. Marcus, I said gently. He looked at me. I gave a small, quiet shake of my head. Not yet. He sat back. Gerald continued. The ER is a remarkable environment, truly. High stakes, fast decisions. I have enormous respect for the staff who work those shifts. He turned to me with genuine warmth. It's just, and I say this with no disrespect, it's a different kind of medicine than what I practiced. Different decision-making. Different depth of relationship with the patient. That's true, I said. The attending physicians in a surgical department carry a different kind of weight, he said. They're making decisions that will affect a patient's body for the rest of their life. That responsibility shapes you. He paused. Have you thought about whether you'd ever want to move into a more specialized area? Or is the ER where you see yourself long-term? There was a particular texture to that question. It wasn't hostile, but it was the question of someone who had already decided that the ER was a starting place, not a destination. The question of someone who looked across the table and saw a young woman in her early 30s who had chosen nursing because she wanted to help people, and who might someday, with the right encouragement, consider going back to school. Marcus set his fork down. Sandra looked at me. I took a sip of water. I set the glass down on the white tablecloth, and then I looked at Gerald Webb very calmly and said, "I've actually been in emergency medicine for about 7 years now. The last 3 of those as an attending." Gerald nodded, processing. "Right. And you enjoy it?" "I do." I paused. "I'm a trauma surgeon, Gerald. I'm the trauma attending at St. Catherine's Level 1 Trauma Center." Gerald looked at me. He didn't move for a moment. Not the way he stopped moving when Sandra told a joke. A different kind of stillness. The kind that happens when your brain is doing rapid, involuntary recalculation. "Trauma attending," he said. "Yes." "At St. Catherine's?" "Yes." He glanced at Marcus. Marcus met his eyes steadily and did not say anything. Gerald looked back at me. Something was moving behind his eyes, the clinical assessment, suddenly sharpened by new information. The way he'd looked at me when I walked in the door, that quick involuntary inventory, he was doing it again, but this time he was finding things he had missed the first time. "How long?" he said slowly. "Have you been an attending?" 3 years, I said. "I finished my residency at Vanderbilt. 7 years, including fellowship." Gerald set down his wine glass. He was quiet for what felt like a long time, though it was probably 15 seconds. Sandra reached over and put her hand on his arm. Gerald started, then stopped. Marcus spoke quietly. "I should have told you earlier, Dad. That's on me." Gerald shook his head. "Not disagreeing, just absorbing. You're a trauma surgeon." "Yes." He looked at the table for a moment. The man who had spent the last hour explaining clinical judgment to me now had the particular expression of someone watching a tape of themselves they cannot stop. "I was telling you," he said slowly, "about earning experience. You were. And you have been operating on trauma patients for 7 years." "Yes." There was another silence. Sandra looked between us. Gerald rubbed one thumb along the side of his wine glass. "Finally," he said, very quietly, "Well, I have made quite an assumption." Marcus let out a careful breath. Sandra said softly, "Gerald." "No," he said. "I made an assumption." He looked at me. The certainty that had filled the room an hour earlier was completely gone from his face. "And I talked down to you in my own home." "You didn't know," I said. "That's not the point." I waited. "The point is," he said carefully, "that I decided who you were before you said a word. And I spent the rest of the evening making sure you knew what I had decided." He exhaled slowly. That is not how I was trained to think." Sandra said, "Sweetheart, I'm a physician," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "I was taught that assumptions in a diagnostic context get people killed." He looked at me. I should know better than to make them socially. No one reached for their food. Then Marcus said something gentle and true. "Dad, she came here tonight to meet you, not to correct you." Gerald looked at his son, then back at me. "You were very patient." "You weren't being unkind," I said. "You were talking about something you care about." I was being a fool. "You were being a doctor who misses his work." I said it as honestly as I could. "That's something I understand." That answer seemed to catch him off guard. His expression shifted, something softened in it, the defensive layer going quiet. Sandra squeezed Gerald's arm. Then she looked at me with eyes that said about 100 things she would say properly later, in a phone call, in a kitchen, some other quieter moment between women. "Well," she said softly, "shall we finish eating before everything gets cold?" Gerald nodded once, stiffly. Then he picked up his fork, and for the rest of the meal, he was notably, deliberately quiet. After dinner, Marcus helped Sandra clear the plates. I heard them in the kitchen, water running, the soft clink of the good china being washed by hand. Gerald had gone to stand by the back window, looking out at the dark yard where a string of outdoor lights ran along the fence line. I stood near the fireplace for a moment, and then I walked over. He didn't turn around when I approached, but he spoke. "I've spent 40 years, he said, believing I was a good judge of people. I didn't say anything. I came up in a time when medicine had a certain shape," he continued. You knew what the surgeon looked like. You knew what the senior physician looked like. The picture was consistent. He finally turned to look at me. I've been telling myself for the last 2 years that I support how things have changed, that I understand the field is different now. But tonight, I said gently. But tonight I sat across from a level 1 trauma attending and spent 45 minutes explaining to her what surgical experience feels like. He said it flatly, without softening it. I didn't even consider the other possibility. Most people don't. Most people haven't spent 4 decades in a field where not considering a possibility is how patients get hurt. He looked at me directly. I should have asked you a question before I gave you a lecture. You asked some questions. I asked questions to confirm what I already believed. He paused. That's not the same thing. The fireplace crackled behind me. Outside, a car drove slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping across the yard. Gerald took a breath. Can I ask you something now? Of course. How did you stay calm during that? He said it with genuine curiosity. I watched you during dinner. You never once looked irritated. You answered every condescending question with complete he searched for the word. Steadiness. I thought about how to answer that honestly. It's something you build, I said. When you're the only woman in an OR for years, you either learn to stay steady or you spend all your energy being angry. And anger doesn't help you operate. Gerald was quiet for a moment. That's a harder thing to say than it sounds. Maybe. He stopped. What you're describing is having to earn your patience the way other people earn their skills. At the same time, in the same years. Yes. He shook his head slowly. I hadn't thought about it that way. We stood there together for a moment. Outside, one of the fence lights blinked off and on. Marcus loves you, Gerald said. I know. He has never been easy to impress. He looked at me. He didn't tell me who you were, and I think part of the reason, not just the reason he gave, is that he was proud of you. Proud in a way that he wasn't sure I would understand yet. I didn't have a response to that. That says something about me, Gerald said quietly. Not flattering. It says something that you're standing here right now. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way people nod when they're done arguing with themselves. I'd like to start over, he said. If that's something you're willing to do. I'm willing. Good. He extended his hand. Not the measured handshake from earlier. This one was different, slower, deliberate, with the weight of someone who means it. Dr. Holt. I shook it. Claire is fine. He almost smiled. Claire. Marcus appeared in the doorway from the kitchen holding a dish towel and looking between us. Everything all right? We're talking, Gerald said, and his voice had changed. The instructional tone was gone. What was left was something older and quieter. Your mother needs help with the pie. Marcus looked at me. I gave a small nod. He disappeared back into the kitchen. Gerald and I stood by the window for another few minutes. He asked me a real question, not a testing question, not a leading one about what trauma surgery looked like in a level 1 center on a Saturday night. I told him. He listened in the way surgeons listen when they're genuinely interested, nodding at specific details, asking small technical follow-ups that told me exactly how sharp he still was under all the performance of the evening. By the time Sandra called us in for pie, something had shifted between us. Not everything. Not 40 years of assumption, but something. Gerald called me 11 days later. I was reviewing a patient chart in my office when the call came through. My assistant leaned in and said, "Personal call, Dr. Holt." A Gerald Webb? I set the chart down. Put him through. There was a brief pause, and then Gerald's voice, quieter than I remembered. The certainty gone, replaced with something more careful. "Claire," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not. What's on your mind?" He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about Christmas Eve since Christmas Eve, and I wanted to say something properly. Not in the moment, with everyone standing around. Properly." I waited. "I made assumptions about you that I would have never made about a male colleague walking into my home," he said. "I want to be clear that I understand that. I'm not confused about it. I treated you as less than you are because you looked the way you looked and you didn't correct me, and I let that run." "Gerald." "Let me finish." He paused. "I told dozens of residents over the years that good medicine starts with humility, that the most dangerous thing in an OR is a physician who stopped asking questions." Another pause. "I stopped asking questions at my own dinner table." The line was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to have you and Marcus over again. he said. Whenever you're both free. No agenda, no lectures, a beat of silence, and then, dryly, at least, I'll try. I smiled. I'd like that. Good. He seemed relieved. Sandra will probably cook the same meal. She believes in repetition as a form of repair. That sounds about right to me. We agreed on a Saturday 3 weeks out, and he thanked me for picking up the call. Before I hung up, I said, Gerald, can I ask you something? Of course. What made you pick up the phone? He was quiet for a moment. I was talking to an old colleague of mine from Vanderbilt. He's 81 now, barely leaves the house, sharp as ever. I told him what happened at dinner and he listened to the whole thing, and then he said something I've been thinking about ever since. What did he say? He said, Gerald, you spent 40 years teaching people how to be better physicians. Maybe now someone will teach you. A short, self-deprecating pause. He was referring to you. I didn't say anything. He wasn't wrong, Gerald said. We drove back to his parents' house on a Saturday in late January. Same street, same flag, same white colonial at the end of the block. But Marcus didn't grip the steering wheel the whole drive this time. He had the radio on low, and somewhere past the Brentwood exit he reached over and put his hand over mine. You nervous? He asked. No, I said. Me neither. He glanced at me. Mostly. I laughed. Gerald opened the front door before we reached the porch. He stepped forward immediately, not the careful assessment of Christmas Eve. He reached out and shook my hand first, before Marcus, and his grip was warm and unhurried. Claire. Good to see you. You too, Gerald. Sandra appeared behind him. You came back. She said it to me, softly, and there was something in it that was more than a greeting. Of course, I said. We went inside. The house smelled the same. Sandra had made roast turkey again, and there were mashed potatoes on the stove. Gerald noticed me looking toward the kitchen. She insisted, he said. Why the same meal? Marcus asked. Sandra set down a serving dish. Because if we're building a new memory, we might as well start from the same place. Gerald pulled out my chair before he sat down himself. It was a small thing, an intentional one. Dinner started quietly. Sandra asked about the hospital, and I told her about a difficult case that had gone well that week, a patient who had come in critical and walked out 10 days later. She listened with genuine interest. Marcus talked about a compound his lab had been developing. Gerald ate and listened more than he spoke, which felt different from the first dinner in every possible way. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and placed both hands flat on the table. Marcus looked up. Sandra went still. Gerald looked at me. Before anything else, he said, I want to say something. He glanced at his son briefly, then back to me. On Christmas Eve, I walked into a conversation that was none of mine. I decided who you were the moment you walked in the door, and I spent the rest of the evening making sure you knew my opinion of a woman I had never once given a fair chance to speak. No one interrupted. The Marine Corps. He stopped and started again. The medical community I came up in taught me that experience commands respect. That's true, but somewhere along the way I confused that with the idea that experience looks a certain way, that it belongs to certain people. He looked at me steadily. You made it possible for me to correct that mistake quietly, and with more dignity than I deserved. The room was very still. I'm proud of the physician I was, he said, and I would like to be proud of the person I become after tonight. Marcus exhaled slowly. Sandra wiped the corner of her eye with her napkin, quickly, like she hoped no one noticed. I noticed. Gerald picked up his fork. That's all, he said. The turkey is getting cold. Marcus laughed, something between relief and emotion, and Sandra laughed too, and the tension that had been holding its breath since the front door broke open into something else entirely. After dinner, while Marcus and Sandra were clearing the plates, Gerald and I ended up on the back porch again. The January air was cold and clean, and the yard was dark beyond the reach of the porch light. You know what I've been thinking about, he said. What? You could have corrected me at any point that night. I gave you about 15 opportunities. He looked out at the yard. Why didn't you? I thought about how to answer that. The real answer, not the easy one. Because I've been correcting people my whole career, I said. In operating rooms, in teaching rounds, in boardrooms where I was the only person in the room who looked like me. And I've learned that correcting someone who has already decided who you are doesn't change what they believe. It just makes them defensive. I looked at him. I needed you to come to it yourself." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "And if I hadn't?" he asked. "Then I would have had very clear information about who you are," I said. "And Marcus and I would have figured out what to do with that information." He nodded slowly. "That's a colder calculation than it sounds." "It's not cold," I said. "It's just honest." Gerald looked at the dark yard for a while. Then he said, "I told a resident once, young woman, brilliant, one of the best I ever had, that she would have to work twice as hard as her male colleagues to be taken half as seriously. I said it like it was wisdom, like I was doing her a favor." He shook his head. "I never once thought about the fact that I was part of the reason that sentence was true." I didn't say anything. "I'm saying it badly," he said. "No," I said. "You're saying it exactly right." He looked at me. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered the question seriously. "Someone who would either fold under the pressure or push back hard. Those are the two options I unconsciously gave you." He paused. "You chose a third one I didn't offer." "What's that?" "Patience," he said. "Real patience. Not waiting it out. Actually deciding that I was worth waiting for." The porch light caught his face, and in that moment he looked his age not in a diminished way, but in the way of someone who has lived long enough to understand what it costs to be wrong and what it means to actually admit it. "You are worth waiting for," I said. "You're going to be Marcus's father for the rest of our lives. That matters to me." Gerald nodded once. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then Marcus slid the back door open. "You two solving everything out here?" "Working on it," Gerald said. Marcus stepped out and handed us each a cup of coffee. For a moment, the three of us stood there in the cold, the yard quiet, the neighborhood settled around us. On the drive home, Marcus was relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before dinner. He drove one-handed, the heater running low, the streets of Brentwood dark and empty around us. "Thank you," he said after a while. "For what?" "For giving him the chance to be better." He glanced over. "You didn't have to do that." I looked out at the road ahead. I thought about what Gerald had said on the porch, about patience, about deciding someone was worth waiting for. I thought about how many times in my career I had been handed a version of that same test and how many different ways I had learned to pass it. "Yes, I did," I said. "That's family." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have told him from the beginning." "Probably. I thought I was protecting you." "I know." I looked at him. "Next time, protect me differently." He reached over and took my hand. "Deal." We drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable kind of silence that belongs to people who have gotten through something together. I've thought about that dinner a lot since then. Not the hard parts, though I've thought about those too. Mostly I've thought about what Gerald said on the porch, in January, standing in the cold with his coffee going cold in his hands. He said the most powerful response he had ever witnessed in a room wasn't the loudest one, it was the steadiest. In medicine, we talk about composure as a clinical skill. The ability to stay level when everything around you is not, to make a clear decision in a loud moment, to not let what you feel in your hands travel up your arms and into your judgment. I learned that in an OR. I've used it in rooms where I wasn't wanted, in conversations where I was underestimated, in families where I had to earn my place not through credentials but through something quieter and harder to name. I'm not sure there's a word for it. Gerald called it patience. My old residency supervisor, the one who didn't think women belonged in trauma surgery, called it stubbornness, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. I think of it as bearing, staying present, staying clear, letting the room settle around you rather than fighting it. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes when you stay steady long enough, the room starts to settle into something better than it was before.